Hi. I did like a minor vlog about Twitter and about how I'd use Twitter, and it kind of got me thinking. So I thought I would do this next video directly to Dawn Foster because I just wanted to clarify, because there's been a bit of a misunderstanding between me and Dawn. So I thought I would clarify to her the nature of our relationship and the relationship of me and her peers. Because far from being in conflict with her peers, I wanted to be clear that I was actually more grateful to Dawn's close personal friends than I could possibly be. And if it wasn't for the unintended consequences of their actions for so many other people, I would actually be sending them a cake to say thank you for their last 8 years. So, just to clarify, Dawn Foster is the social affairs editor of The Guardian. So she currently occupies a position where she is the main media voice for all the systems that I outlined in the playlist Evolution of Systems, which you can find over there or there, I'm not sure where. Now, Dawn is close personal friends with the elite brats that I discussed from Oxford University, and with, she's Guardian social affairs editor, and she's done very, very well in the last 8 years. And I thought we should discuss how she's done very well, and we should discuss the cost of what her and her friends have done. So, Dawn, you might want to review the playlist Evolution of Systems. And actually, you need to do that because you're the voice of those systems, and for the first time in your career, you might want to know something about them. So, just to clarify, there is no possible way that anybody with any understanding of these systems could believe that there was anything but absolute political consensus on austerity's focus on local authorities and our cash transfer system. So on our welfare system and our cash transfer system, there has been absolute political consensus on the reshaping of those institutions, which is still in place, because you can see from the playlist about mediating evolution of a mediating class that I've had to go to LSE directly to find out the structure of that, and you can go through that playlist and you can find that that's absolutely the case. So there is absolutely no way that anybody at all could possibly believe that there is anything but complete political consensus on welfare reform and local authority reform. Now, as Corbyn's manifesto upheld welfare cuts after it was apparent that universal credit wasn't deliverable, after 8 years of a fake anti-cuts movement, I think that's now undeniable. Now, I spoke in another video about the fact that we're going to have to come up with methodology to count the dead. And it's looking like the deaths as a consequence of both welfare reform and local authority reform are, well, it's going to be 6 figures, I think, at least. But that's going to take about 10 years for that context. So this is all context that Dawn is not aware of in her position as the social affairs editor at the main newspaper that speaks for these systems. Now, I met Dawn's friends at Oxford University in 2010, and I'll upload underneath what I said to them in 2010, which was about the way that austerity would impact women and those systems, which has been uninterrupted. But Dawn's friends did something incredibly interesting. So, up until now, elite social closure has meant that the parasitic dynamic where Dawn's friends believed from the fringes of Oxford at the Dossers wing that you could identify as someone's representation, this is a false belief that has taken hold over quite a number of years as media democracy has emerged, but it's actually a false belief. Now, in 2010, I was invited to speak at Oxford University about austerity, which was subject to consensus this entire time, because apparently Dawn's friends felt that this was their moment. Now, what Dawn's friends have demonstrated in the 8 years since has been incredibly useful. So they are the first media class where social communication has been introduced to political communication, so that they actually have to reproduce social relations. So this is the first media class in the entire neoliberal consensus where people directly ask them personally not to do this and explain the consequences. And I've made sure that by writing for The Guardian, The New Statesman, speaking at Oxford University, going to LSE, at all these institutions, everybody was aware of this, and it's on record that they were aware of this. So, because Dawn's friends identified as our representation, they went on to demonstrate how the neoliberal consensus had been held up for 8 years. And they introduced, because when they were faced with a world where people would say, hi, you're preventing discussion on welfare reform and local authority reform that's killing people, they've had to introduce narcissistic abuse, intimidation, and anti-Semitism to our political system. And they've now come up with the word TERF, so that the social affairs editor of The Guardian now believes that every single person contained within equality legislation, safeguarding legislation, and all these frameworks where everybody's by definition vulnerable deserves to be hit if they discuss the rule of law that Dawn should be aware of in her capacity as social affairs editor. Now, in this period, there were several strands to the left. So we had the main Labour left, who from Netroots onwards, they were trying to triangulate on welfare reform by creating a false anti-cuts movement. And they, luckily, because they identified as our representation, and because there's quite a few psychopaths in there, and narcissists, they've done this quite openly. So they've created a public record for 8 years of how they manufacture tribalism to prevent discussion of consensus, a consensus that is over. Now, in that time, they have managed to demonstrate elite social closure of the power of labour itself, so that's a direct power transfer from politically neutral cash transfer workers and local authority workers into the hands of the people around Dawn, the half a dozen or so people that we're talking about, who apparently are entitled to that political capital for low-paid women and the most vulnerable service users in the country, social care users, looked after children, and the women impacted by austerity. That political capital has been taken by Dawn's Oxford friends. So in order to get the power of trade unions now, what you have to do is be a dosser at Oxford. Not go to your lectures, you just have to hang around with the left. And so the trade unions that should have been discussing political consensus on welfare reform and on local authority reform and discussing those service users and the rule of law that has evolved, instead spent 8 years actively preventing it. Now, the reason that they did this was because they wanted to recreate a class identity where the left were our natural representation and the poor could audition, presumably through Twitter, for pity. Now, I don't know whether Dawn is aware, but in 1945 we established the welfare state and the rule of law evolved, and that's no longer the case. And intersectionality has been firmly embedded in those systems, and what intersectionality is about, it's about the fact that all practitioners within these systems reflect on their own identity and the power that they have, so that they don't accidentally reproduce power relations in the way that Dawn's friends have. And the reason they also do that is because what we've learned firmly through the evolution of the welfare state is that if you do not reflect on the power that you have, especially if you identify as good, you will seek to protect that identity as good. So because Dawn's peers, so that would be people like James Butler and Aaron Bastani and Owen Jones and Ellie Mae Hagan and Zoe Williams, because they identify as good, while 100,000 people or so died, and while people begged them to not prevent discussion of welfare reform by creating artificial tribalism that was absolutely irrelevant, they said that their identity was more important than those people. Now, Dawn, I'm a social worker, so once I'd met your friends, I knew that it was very, very odd that there was a group of Oxbridge dossers who felt that they were my representation without my permission, who could then target me, by the way. And we're going to discuss that in a minute and why they did that. So I knew at this point what had occurred, because I knew that what had happened was a mediating class had re-emerged and that we were coming to the end of a cycle. But the shifts that I discussed in that playlist, you can't get out. Your newspaper will not survive unless you address them. But now we have to address why you and your friends have spent 8 years openly preventing discussion of welfare reform and local authority changes while people begged you not to. Now, what your friends had to do quite immediately was they realised I would only discuss political consensus because this is about the rule of law. They terrorised me, and they terrorised me while I had malnutrition. They decided I was a scab. That was peers of James Butler's and Adam Ramsey's. Adam Ramsey's the son of a laird. and their friends decided that social workers who pay into the strike fund to meet their responsibility to children who have no other representation, that means you're a scab. Even though no social worker would expect another social worker to put a child second to appease this nonsense. And they quote Jack London. And they terrorised me using this lame excuse. But luckily, I knew what that was. And while I was grateful for Dawn's friends in letting us know that they didn't know what a trade union was, and that they were willing to abuse and physically intimidate a single mother and a 5-year-old child to protect their ability to identify as her representation, what they were doing was, because they had constructed a false identity for themselves, they had then had to devalue me as an object. This is a very common process with narcissists. And then what they would do is project all their dysfunction onto the object, which at some points has been me, but as a lot of other people, so that they can attack them for it, so that they can maintain this false identity that they've generated at Oxford University. And so what you see on Twitter now is they just go round and round doing that over and over again, over and over and again, and they're caught in a chat room created by their abusive behaviour without the slightest trace of self-awareness of what they're saying, continually preventing discussion on welfare reform and local authority reform, and instead reproducing structures around this false identity that they've gained at Oxford University. Now, luckily, I'm not on Twitter anymore. In fact, they've abused so many people. It's remarkable that this tiny little social network have stayed so tight. It's actually, you know, your social connections must be really, really, really secure. And so what will happen now, and what Dawn has done, is they're all caught in this little chat room around The Guardian who can't get out of this. The newspaper won't survive. They've spent 8 years preventing discussion of consensus on the changes outlined in that playlist, Evolution of Systems. They've done so while at least 100,000 people died, and while they were repeatedly made aware of the consequences of doing so in public, on record. So that means that Dawn's peers are the first generation of our media class to do that while people begged them not to. And the first generation of her class, because even though Dawn plays up, I think she's got very, very posh recently, it's not really her class, she just wants to be in it. That's the first time that that class has felt able to do that since 1945. And what Dawn's peers assumed would happen is that the welfare state would roll back and that we would suddenly revert to auditioning to the left for pity. But what's actually happened is we have major institutional failure that The Guardian are not able to comment on. We have Dawn christening anybody who discusses these systems a TERF. So they've excluded themselves from even discussing this. Her friends have demonstrated how the neoliberal consensus was always held up. And with their focus on their own identity, they have shown the danger of people with power being unable to reflect on their identity and the way that that generates the reproduction of abusive systems which harm women. So this is all really useful, Dawn. But the thing is, I was only ever on Twitter to talk to my friends, and I took your friends at face value. So when they said they wanted to oppose austerity, I took that at face value. When they said they were not going to oppose austerity, I took that at face value. And then I recorded how the Labour left and the centre left triangulated on austerity for 8 years while 100,000 or so people died, while you were begged not to. And that record isn't for now. I don't want to be in your world. I don't want to work for The Guardian. I don't want to be in a social network full of psychopaths who would do that to so many people and who would take such pleasure in disenfranchising the poorest people in the world. But Dawn, the crisis that you have generated through prevention of discussion of welfare reform while people begged you not to, they still have to be addressed. We still have to accommodate those shifts. The only difference now is that The Guardian has shown that they don't have any understanding of these systems, which, as you've been the main voice of these systems for 30-odd years, would explain quite a lot. So Dawn, I'm not at all cross at you and your friends. Well, I am on behalf of the people who died because of your direct actions. But I'm quite happy that you're going to be the most famous British left in history, and that you did that using a written chronological record over 8 years. And I'm happy that for the rest of your life, you and your half a dozen or so friends will have to live with the fact that 100,000 people died while people begged you to stop preventing discussion of it. Now, when your friends are terrorising someone